In this video, we'll tackle each section of the MCAT, what kinds of questions you'll be asked, what the material is over, and end with discussing how the schools look at each different section in terms of importance. I'll also be going through these sections in the order they will appear on the real test. Starting up, we have Chemical and Physical Foundations of Biological Systems, or just a fancy way to say chemistry and physics. The Chem Phys section will ask 59 questions, with 25% involving material from the first semester of Biochem, 5% from Intro Bio, 30% Gen Chem, 15% OChem, and 25% Intro Physics. Here is a list of topics on the right that the MCAT might ask you about, and the abundance of a particular topic might change from test to test. So one thing you will notice about the MCAT, the more you learn about it and practice it, is that each section has a theme on how they ask you questions. Chem Phys is a section with the most straightforward questions, such as asking you to determine what the pH will be for a given reaction or what the charge of iron would be in the oxidized state. There might be some graphs or charts you will have to look at, but most of the questions in this section will be very direct. Also, remember you will have 95 minutes to complete this section. After a quick 10-minute break, we move on to the Critical Analysis and Reasoning Skills section, or CARS for short. This section will look a lot like a bulk of the SAT if you ended up taking that when you were still in high school. There will be 9 passages with anywhere from 5 to 7 questions per passage, totaling 53 questions for the entire section. 30% of these will be comprehension-based, 40% will be reasoning within the text, and 40% will be reasoning beyond the text. We will go over what these are in just a second. Usually, half of the passages you see will be based on the humanities, while the other half will be based on social sciences. Let's start with what a comprehension question might look like. One example could be, which of the following best captures the main point of the passage? With this question, the MCAT is trying to see how well you understood the passage after reading it, and if you can infer an answer choice given what you read. There can be all kinds of questions like this that test just to see whether or not you can comprehend something that you are reading. Moving on to reasoning within the text, there are actually a few different themes they can ask. They can ask you a structural question where you have to identify how the author is trying to relate ideas. They can ask you an evaluative question where you have to criticize and consider flaws in the author's argument, or they can ask you an unstated assumption question where you have to use the information provided to infer a belief about the author even if they don't specifically say it. For instance, let's look at a question like, what assumption does the author make about gun violence? If the author makes the claim that raising the price of bullets will lower gun violence, then the author is assuming people who commit gun violence aren't willing to buy bullets at a higher price. And finally, arguably the hardest kind of question in this section, we have the reasoning beyond the text. The reason why this is difficult is because you have to apply what you learned from reading the passage into answering a question that has nothing to do with the passage. Think of it like using your imagination to answer a question. Here's an example. Imagine that humans had no thumbs. How would this change the author's argument? You have to understand the author's argument well enough that if presented in a different scenario, you can apply what you know to reach an outcome. These kinds of questions are typically the most frequently missed on the test, which means practicing them will be very important for you. I am giving you a link to a page on Khan Academy where they go through different kinds of questions in the CARS section, in case you want to learn more about or see other examples. One last point I will make here is to stress the importance of practice, especially with this section. Because there is a lot of reading, some students aren't able to finish in time, or they get mentally fatigued with all the reading, so building some endurance for this section in particular is really important. Okay, after a much-needed 30-minute break, you will move on to the Biological and Biochemical Foundations of Living Systems section, or just biology. Like the Chem Phys section, there will also be 59 questions here, with 25% having to do with first semester biochem, 65% intro bio, 5% gen chem, and 5% OChem. Again, here on the right, I am showing you all sorts of topics that the test could ask you during this section. What's the theme with this section, you might ask? Well, the biology section loves to test your ability to read about an experiment that was conducted and see if you can answer a few questions about it. So rather than just straight up asking you about a stem cell lineage, for instance, they might give you a complicated sounding experiment involving genetically altered mice with bits of information you've never seen before, and just slip in a question about what class of stem cell was seen in the experiment. There aren't going to be as many straightforward questions like in Chem Phys, so make sure you are reading these experimental scenarios carefully and applying what you know about biology to answer the questions. And then finally, after another 10-minute break, we reach the final section of the test. You can almost see the light at the end of the tunnel, but it's really important that you don't let the testing fatigue get the better of you just yet. We have the psychological, social, and biological foundations of behavior section still to go. This section, all about psychology and sociology, will again be asking you 59 questions with 65% having to do with intro psych, 30% intro sociology, and 5% intro bio. Here are some of the topics the test might ask you in this section. Psych Soc is all about two things. Can you read and understand a graph? And can you memorize things? Studying for this section might simultaneously be the most time-consuming but also the easiest. Most of the questions they ask you in Psych Soc will be very straightforward and all about memorization. They could ask you a question about Freud, they could ask you about the name of a particular survey, they could ask you to identify an example of a cognitive dissonance. Basically, all these questions will involve words or phrases that you will have to memorize ahead of time to understand the meaning. Also, they love giving you graphs or charts in this section. They want to test your ability to read and understand a graph because you will inevitably come across research, and being able to understand figures like that is key for success. Alright, probably the part you've been waiting for. Which section is the most important? If you had to pick one section to do really well on, which would you pick? Well, I kind of gave a big hint with this one since I spent the most time talking about it, but it's actually the cars section. I know that might disappoint you since it's literally the one section that doesn't test your knowledge of the sciences, but it does test something much more important in the eyes of medical schools. It tests your ability to quickly gather information using evidence provided, analyze it, and reach conclusions after critical thinking. This process is imperative to be successful as a clinician because it kind of mimics what having a patient is like. When they come in for the first time, you use whatever they tell you and their presenting symptoms to reach a conclusion about what might be wrong by critically thinking and analyzing the evidence provided. So, while this section may not have any direct correlation with how well you know the sciences, it can really prove something about your ability to critically think. Alright, next up we actually have a tie. Biology and Chem Phys is probably the next most important. Just to be honest, all three of the remaining sections are about just as important, but I am putting Psych Soc last for a reason. While each section has its own theme and each has its own purpose, the reason I'm putting Psych Soc last is because it's heavily just based on whether or not you could memorize something. Also, the relevance of that section is probably the lowest in terms of what material prepares you the best for med school. It's just my personal opinion that schools don't care as much about Psych Soc compared to Chem Phys or biology, but I can say as a fact that they absolutely care most about cars. So now that you know what to expect with each section of the test, I hope you are able to determine what areas to focus studying on or practicing based on what your needs are right now. But like I said in the preparation video, your best friend when it comes to studying will be practice tests, practice tests, practice tests.